Is the God of the Old Testament a monster? That's the question we're wrestling with today. Welcome to Whiskey in the Writings, a place for the skeptic, the spiritually curious, and those who still believe, maybe just not like they used to. This is a place where you can wrestle with the Bible, Jesus, God, honestly, safely, and really explore your faith in a new and exciting way. My name is Joe Oliver, and for the past 24 years, I've been in pastoral ministry serving in churches. I hold a master's degree in biblical theology, and if you've got questions, this is your place. Let's jump right in. So today we're wrestling with that question. What's the deal with the God of the Old Testament? Now, this has been a conversation that's been had for centuries in Christianity. I don't suppose that I have any grand new amazing revelation about how to reconcile these differences. There are a lot of great theologians that have done probably better work than I'll ever do on this conversation, but I bring it up in particular because I got a comment recently on our YouTube channel, and this question was asked of me. How do we reconcile the Jesus that we see in the New Testament versus the God that we see in the Old Testament? And I think this is a genuine question. If you've ever spent time reading the Old Testament, you'll see very quickly the God that exists there has some really great and beautiful moments, but then also has some stuff that through our perspective looks very problematic. And then we go to Jesus, and we love what Jesus does. We're like, this guy, this is what it's all about. And so we're going to look at the differences here on Whiskey in the Writings today and see if we can't make sense of the God of the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament. Let's get started. So we are starting off with our whiskey, and today I'm excited to try something I've never tried before. This is Penelope Bourbon. Have you ever seen this before? It started showing up on our shelves a little while back here in Boise. I have a friend that really enjoyed it. I was having a conversation a while back with a friend that was like, have you tried Penelope Bourbon? And I'm like, no, I haven't, and never even heard of it before. And he just swore up and down that it was such a great bourbon. And so I thought, let's go try it out. Let's see what it's like here on Whiskey in the Writings. So if you've ever had this before, I'd love to hear your thoughts. My friend that I was talking to said if I could find one that's in a pink, I think he said pink. Let me look up what he said here. I got my phone right here. He said, if you ever see the weeded with the yellow label, that is the golden child. So the yellow label, Marcus tells me, is the one. This is the red label, but he said if you can't find the yellow label, then this is the one to go with. This is the barrel strength. And so it is sitting at 114 proof. So you've got malted barley, wheat, rye, and corn. So 4-grain version. And so I'm excited to open this up here. I've not had this before, and I might have to do some editing to get past this. All right, get this off here. And we're gonna open this up for the first time. I'm really excited to try this. Okay. Yeah, you can definitely smell the proof, 114 proof. You can definitely smell it. I'm worried that this might be something I need to let breathe a little bit. Maybe even put a dab of water, which I don't have in front of me. So we're gonna let this breathe just for a second. I should have opened it up beforehand, but I'm gonna let it breathe for a second, and then we're gonna cut right back to it. All right, we're back. I let this sit out for a little bit, so to take a little bit of that bite off, let it breathe. Another thing that I had read is when you're doing this, I learned this when I was in Scotland and doing a whiskey tasting. You get to see kind of what body this is. Is it, so how quickly is it draining here from my swish? Tells me, is it a full body? Is it light? You also smell to get the notes. And I'm still smelling a lot of alcohol. Again, I think it's that 114 proof. That's why I didn't pour very much, because the point here isn't to get wasted. The point is to enjoy. And so we're going to try this now. Let's see how it goes down. So there's a bite on the back end. You can feel the burn in the back of the throat. Maybe a dab of water would clean that up a little bit, make it a little smoother. In fact, I think I'm going to go get that now. Okay, I'm back. I've got with me a little glass of water. This is what I brought home from Scotland and the whiskey experience, which was super rad. Normally you would have like a little dropper that you could drop in with water. So I don't have that. And I don't want to pour, because I don't want it to spill too much in and give me too much. So what I do is I just take it with my finger like this, and I just get a few drops in there. Not a lot, just a few drops like that. I'm going to stir that in there, and we're going to take a look. And that does help. And so what I'm looking for now is that flavor. You can really taste that, like a char, like a wood, an oaky, almost caramely, but not as sweet. But it's this is not bad. This will be a fun one to share with some friends. When I have a group that hangs out, we hang out. There's 4 of us in total. There's a group of us, and we just get together and we talk theology. A lot of fun, and drink whiskey. Caleb, Joel, Jay. I'll share this with you when we meet up again. But okay, so that's our bourbon we're drinking. Whatever you have, go get it. Pour your drink. Drink responsibly. Let's get into the text. Okay, so we're having this conversation about the God of the Old Testament, this potentially vengeful, bloodthirsty God that's all about destruction and judgment, versus Jesus in the New Testament. And he's all about love and goodness and all the good things. And one of the things that I want to make sure we start this conversation in is the reality that both extremes in and of themselves are an incomplete picture. So let's just first recognize for a second, as much as we see some problematic texts in our day and age of how God treats people perceived to treat people in the Old Testament, this is also still a God that has a lot of beautiful things happening that can get overlooked with all the negative things. And the same is with Jesus. Sometimes we paint Jesus as like this, oh, he's all about love, and it's all goodness, and it's all roses, and it's all, fields that are beautiful. And Jesus actually was pretty controversial. And if you really spend time in the Gospels, you're going to see a Jesus who is love and willing to bring people in. But he's also going to be a Jesus that is straightforward and says some pretty hard things. And so we can't just lump the God of the Old Testament with all bad and Jesus in the New Testament is all good. It's a mixed bag. Sometimes the God of the Old Testament does some things that we go, ooh, I don't like that. And sometimes he does some things we go, oh, I like that. And Jesus, in the same way, sometimes does some things that we go, oh, I love that. And actually does some things sometimes we go, ooh, I don't know that I like that. And so both have both sides of the same coin. And so let's make sure that we don't just oversimplify the conversation by saying the God of the Old Testament's all bad and Jesus is all good. They're both all good. And I think we really need to wrestle with what does it mean to truly understand them for the place that they're in, and what does that have to do, and what does that mean for us today? So we're going to look at a few different things. And I think second, let me say this as well. This is just me and my point of view. I've read stuff on this, and so I do have a point of view. But there are a lot of scholars that have done a lot of great work on this conversation, and I encourage you to spend time looking into that. I want to recommend a couple resources that might be helpful for you. First resource might be, and this is for an entry-level reading. So if you're getting into these conversations and you've not been theologically trained or read theological works before and you're just doing entry-level work on this conversation, this is a great starter. It's by Dan Kimball. It's called How Not to Read the Bible. Making sense of anti-women, anti-science, pro-violence, pro-slavery, and other crazy-sounding parts of Scripture. So if you're just getting into this conversation, this is a book I encourage you to read. It has chapters on the subject. If you're going a little bit further in your studies and you want something a little bit more rich, deep, and more meaningful, I would actually go with, let's just pull this one down. You can do the IVP Bible Background Commentary, the Old Testament. This is put on by John Walton, Victor Matthews, and Mark Chavalis. This is a great resource because you can go to specific places in the Old Testament that you're struggling with understanding, and it actually gives you the background historical context that might shed light on some of these problematic passages that you're thinking about. And so this is a great resource for you as well. It's thick, it's heavy, so maybe get the digital version, might be able to bounce around a little bit easier. That's a great resource because you're looking at the historical background that gives you context for what was happening and might help you understand why what happened, if that makes sense. I might turn to, this is my survey of the Old Testament. This is, again, Andrew Hill and John Walton. And it'll take you through major themes of books of the Bible that will help you understand the purpose, the background, the setting, that might give you context to Old Testament passages that are problematic. I will link to these in the show notes so you can go check them out and pick them up. But those might be great resources for you. So all that to say, here we go. When we are trying to entertain this conversation, God of the Old Testament, Jesus of the New Testament, if we want to understand God in the Old Testament, in my opinion, we need to look at him through the lens of Jesus in the New Testament. Looking back at the events in the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus. Well, what do I mean by that? First, let me take you to Hebrews. This is a New Testament writing by, we don't know who. Could have been Paul, could have been Barnabas. We're not really sure who wrote Hebrews. But whoever it was trying to connect Jesus to the Jewish story. The Jewish story found in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Exodus, Moses, angels, all these elements. So it's a very Jewish-centered piece of literature. That's important for this conversation because we're talking about the God of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And so how did people see Jesus in light of what the Old Testament is showing us and the picture it's presenting? And this is how the writer of Hebrews starts his writing, or her writing. After God spoke long ago in various portions and in various ways to our ancestors through the prophets, in these last days he has spoken to us in a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things and through whom he created the world. The Son is the radiance of his glory and the representation of his essence. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. And so when he had accomplished cleansing for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. There's a couple key elements I want to draw out of this passage. So it's connecting, it's talking about Jesus. And it starts out with saying that God had spoken to his people long ago. So he's referencing these Old Testament writings, the Hebrew Bible. He talks about how he spoke through the prophets. So God attempted, according to the writer of Hebrews, God attempted to communicate and work through the Jewish nation. He says now he has spoken through to us in a Son. So he's referencing Jesus here, whom he appointed heir of all things. And so he's talking about his majesty, his glory, that he's in charge of all things. But then he goes on to say this about the Son. So God spoke through to the people directly. Now God's speaking through Jesus, and this is who Jesus is. The Son, again, a reference to Jesus, is the radiance of his glory. Whose glory? God's glory. And the representation of his essence. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. And so when he had accomplished cleansing of sin, he sat down at the right hand of majesty. So what we have here is radiance of his glory, representation of his essence, and sustains all things by what? His word. So for the writer of Hebrews at this point, they are making a claim, a theological claim about the person of Jesus. Now we can debate all day, well, who was Jesus? Was he God? Was he not God? Like, that can be a debate. It wasn't a debate for the writer of Hebrews. We could talk about, was this an early writing, a late writing? Whenever the writing came, it was no debate. The most basic essence of Christian theological understanding is that Jesus is the very Son of God. He is the very essence of God. And this is what the writer of Hebrews is trying to do. Now, why is that important for understanding the God of the Old Testament? Well, if Jesus is the representation, the essence, the one who sustains all things, we ought to be able to see God through Jesus. So when we look at Jesus in the New Testament, we are seeing God in action, God at work. And that's important because this didn't change. It wasn't like Jesus had a personality change when he came and he represented God to the people. He was the same. He wanted of his people the same thing, what God was trying to do at the beginning, where Hebrews says here that God had long ago in various portions and in various ways. It's like God did a lot to communicate to the people of Israel to try to get their attention about what they were there to do in light of their missteps and misguided results of whatever they were doing at that time in their history. God was continually at work. And it's as if the culmination of God being at work is fulfilled through the person of Jesus. So history, the Hebrew Bible, is a story about God constantly speaking and intervening, he says, in various portions and in various ways. So sometimes God did a lot, sometimes he did a little. Sometimes he worked in certain ways and other times he worked in different ways. The point that the writer's trying to get at here in Hebrews is that God was at work. God's always been at work. And so whatever we're seeing in the Old Testament, we need to understand that this is a God who desired to work and reveal himself to his people in various ways and in various portions until ultimately it's as if God finally went, you know what? I'm just going to come down and show them myself. They're not getting it. They're hard, they're thick heads, they're just not getting it. So I'm going to come down and show them myself. Enter Jesus. That's this entry into the writing of Hebrews is where he's pointing us. It's this concept and idea that the God of the universe, who had tried to communicate and intervene and step in all throughout the Hebrew Bible, has finally come and done so himself in the person of Jesus, his Son, to show us the way forward as his people in his kingdom. So that's a lot of theological ideas wrapped up into a few short verses, but it's critical for us to understand that when we look at Jesus, we're looking at the God of the Old Testament. And so that then goes, okay, well, tell me about this God of the Old Testament. What am I seeing here? Or maybe what am I missing? So what I don't want to do right now is gloss over the reality that what we read in the Old Testament is oftentimes very, very difficult to understand. There are things that are deplorable to us in a modern 21st century mindset. And that is exactly my first point. We need to remember when we're reading the Hebrew Bible that this is ancient literature written to an ancient people living in an ancient time in history. This was not written to us. It was written for us. There's wisdom, and we talk about that a lot on Whiskey and the Writings. There is wisdom in this literature, but it wasn't written to you. It was written to an ancient people at an ancient time. And to impose our modern understandings on an ancient text is to do that text a disservice. And I teach this quite a bit when I teach the Bible to people, is that we have to understand the situation, context, people, history, socio-political situations that are happening around them to understand how those things influence what they wrote and what we have today. That's an important distinction. This is an ancient text. So let's remember that when we're reading something in the Old Testament that's difficult to understand and we're like, man, this God seems crazy. Okay, hold on, pause. Maybe the issue isn't that this God is crazy. Maybe the issue is that I don't understand what's happening. I don't understand what's happening because remember, like point one, this is the Jesus. This is the same God that is in Jesus. So maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe we need to humble ourselves and go, maybe I don't understand. Maybe I don't get what's going on here. And we can do two things. We can close our Bibles and go, I guess I just am not going to understand. Or we can dig in and we can do the work. Maybe you'll buy those resources and do some of the work yourself. So I want to set that picture because in this conversation, there is context to how God works in all of this. So for instance, I want to turn to Matthew chapter 19. This is Matthew 19. So this is Jesus, and he's talking about a very difficult conversation, a conversation about divorce. Now, this is not a video about divorce and whether it's right or wrong. It's helping us understand what the motivations behind God might have been in these ancient texts back here. Okay, so this is how Jesus deals with this conversation. So it says this, then some Pharisees came to him. This is 19 verse 3. Then some Pharisees came to him in order to test him. They asked, is it lawful to divorce a wife for any cause? He answered, have you not read from the beginning that the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. So therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So Jesus is affirming here that, yeah, when people get married, that should be with the intention of forever. Okay, it's Jesus is affirming that marriage isn't something you take lightly where you just bounce from one to the other. That doesn't mean there aren't times where that may be necessary. What Jesus is talking about here is a reminder of the original intention of male and female coming together was something that should be taken seriously and should be a forever mindset. He goes on to say this, though. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. So we said that. They said, verse 7, they said, the Pharisees, why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her? So the Pharisees go, okay, Jesus, if this is a forever thing, why did Moses allow it? Why does the law say that we can do this? Now, that's a great argument. So they're trying to trap Jesus here, okay? They're going like, they're trying to pin the law to get him confused. But Jesus is smarter than this, obviously. He says this, Jesus said to them, verse 8, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hard hearts, but from the very beginning, it was not this way. So Jesus identifies something about what the law was doing in this instance. He said, God did this not because he wanted to, because he knew that the people had hard hearts. And so it was God actually acting in a way that was placating to the hardness of the hearts of people. And this is a really important distinction, I believe, Because when we're thinking about the God of the Old Testament, we often think of him as an independent agent that's just exercising authority and power over others. This is not the God of the Old Testament. If we want to understand the God of the Old Testament, we got to spend time in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. And in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, we're introduced to a God that doesn't take, but gives. He gives away his power. He authorizes his image bearers and participates with them. This God is not like the gods that were served long ago. This God is different in that this is a God who gives back. That's the framework we got to see this God if we're going to understand how he's connected to Jesus, because this is who Jesus was. He gave away, right? And so what Jesus is doing is he's explaining to the religious leaders that you think that God did this because he's demanding of you. But what God knew about you, he permitted something to exist because he knew that you were incapable of keeping it. This is an important distinction. So this is an ancient writing in an ancient context, and we have to understand that there are times that this God gets involved and things are allowed to happen, not because this God wants it to happen, but because he's working with humans that have an incapacity to do it any other way. This is a really important point if you're trying to understand the God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament is having to work with humans who are constantly and habitually turning their backs on him. And yet he is so relentless in his pursuit and love for us that he sometimes accommodates our own ignorance. And so sometimes you see in the Bible this reality that God's letting something happen not because he wants it to happen that way, but because he knows that's the only way to take a step forward. Which leads me to my second point here in this, or maybe my third point. I'm losing track. We need to be able to distinguish when we're thinking about the God of the Old Testament between descriptive situations and prescriptive situations. There's a difference, okay? Descriptive means there are times that the writers of the Hebrew Bible are just describing something that took place. That doesn't mean that God wants it, desires it, loves it. It just means this is what happened. And we confuse that sometimes. We think a descriptive event is a prescriptive normative for God. And this is a misguided way of thinking. Not all these stories are simply God orchestrating and making these situations take place. Sometimes it's just the description of an event that took place in light of whether God was involved or not involved. And so there's that. And even when we are in a descriptive situation, there are times that the writers of the Bible may actually be attributing to God something that was not God's to begin with, or God's plan to begin with. And so we have to recognize that. Is this something that God is actually asking for? Is this something that is something that God wants? Is God allowing this to happen because of the hard hearts? These are all things that we've got to wrestle with. There is a tension within the Bible where there is a movement in the story. And so my last point on this, when we're thinking about the God of the Old Testament, we have to remember that all of this is a story that has a movement forward, meaning every step along the way, there is a movement towards what God wants, the reality that he wants for the world that is ultimately realized in Jesus, that's moving the story along. You have stories all over the Bible of just tremendous pain and hurt and suffering. And there's this tension that it's like if we're just cherry picking these verses out, it's really easy to miss the over meta narrative that's happening in the Old Testament. There is a God who created everything good. In fact, he calls it very good. All that he had made. And then he had put humans in place to help him co-rule this good earth. God gives away his power, his authority to these humans to co-rule together on his earth, partnering with God in his good creation. The humans choose to reject that co-rule and want to take the rule and authority for themselves. This is the classic story of humanity. We serve a God who gives. We as humans are people who take. And so God is, through the rest of the story of the Bible, trying to involve himself in the story of humans, trying to redirect and realign them back to his original good. And that story progresses forward. And so in that story, there are a lot of highs and a lot of lows, guys. Just like our own story, there are a lot of highs and there are a lot of lows in your story. The Hebrew Bible is no different. And to attribute one personality to an extreme low in your life, let me ask you this, and we're not God, and so this is probably a terrible example, but this is what's on top of my brain. There are times I am a really bad representation of God. I'm a really bad image bearer. But I'm not defined by those singular moments, right? Because my story is still being written. The story that God's doing in and through me is still being written. And so when you see God working in history, he is often working in history in very low moments as well as very high moments. And we like to celebrate the high moments when God delivers, when God's faithful, when God comes through. And we often look at the same God who's there in the good, but oftentimes in the bad, and we go, ooh, I don't like that. This God's bad. This God's evil. And if we ever reduce anyone to a polar extreme, it's unhealthy, right? Because at any given time, we do good things and we do bad things. That's the story of the Bible. God doesn't change. God's not doing bad. Okay, don't mistake what I'm saying. Like, oh, does that mean God's making mistakes and doing bad things? No. He's partnering with humans where they're at in the midst of the bad to try to bring about good. Here's an analogy I want to use let's get to that with the I'm just saying. We'll stop right here with the text. All right, I'm just saying. We're talking about this extreme polarization of how we view God that we forget oftentimes the ancient context and setting that these stories are wrapped up in. Sometimes we ascribe a prescriptive situation when it's purely descriptive. We ignore the tension that this is an ongoing story that is being played out, not one singular moment in time that defines the attitude and thoughts of God, and that he is working with imperfect humans where they are at, which is often in very low points that he has to bring something out of. So here's the I'm just saying. Too often, we want God to be like us. We want God to think like us. We want God to have the same ideals and vision and hope and all the things that we want. We think we are so enlightened sometimes that it's like, well, why doesn't God do it like this? Why doesn't God just end slavery? Why doesn't God just stop mass genocide? Why doesn't God A, B, or C? Whatever your thing is. And here's the thing about this. I love this analogy because I think this really plays into this, how we ought to think about this. And I heard this analogy from Tom Wright. He said it like this, and this is what he was speaking about when it comes to slavery in the Bible, and the notion that it's like, well, God should just have had abolished slavery. He says, okay, let's think of it like this. There is conclusive evidence that the automobile industry, i.e. cars, trucks, has severely polluted our atmosphere. Conclusive evidence. You can't deny that the emissions coming out of our vehicles are doing something to the air which affects us as humans in a negative way. Have you ever looked at a picture in a summer day at any major metropolitan in the haze? That's all pollution that's sitting in the air, and much of that pollution is caused by vehicles and the emissions that they emit. Now, If I were to come to you and say, we need to ban all cars right now. And some of you are saying, Joe, are you a progressive now? That sounds like a progressive idea. Okay, let's stop jumping to those conclusions. Just sit with me. If I were to come to you and say, do cars harm the environment? And we go, yeah, it harms the environment, right? The evidence is there. You can't deny that. So we should then stop driving cars, right? Valid conclusion. How many people do you think would just stop driving cars right now? Follow my argument here. The impossible task of anyone in our world today saying, this is harming us, so we should stop, would be an almost insurmountable obstacle mountain to climb, right? To get everyone just to stop doing something because it's wrong, okay? Think of slavery in the ancient world. This was a part of the economy. This is how it functioned and worked. And so for Jesus or Paul or anybody to step into the scene and go, hey, everybody, stop doing slavery, they would have been laughed out. No one would have taken them seriously. So what did they have to do? They had to talk about slavery in terms that humanized people so that when people owned slaves, they wouldn't see them as other. They would see them as brother or sister. They introduced a new way to actually see other people, slaves, that would elevate and eventually lead to an abolishment mindset that we see in later on in history. So that's what's happening. And so going back to the God of the Old Testament, we can easily say that this God's barbaric and this God is this and this God is that. What we don't often actually recognize is that maybe what God's doing in some of these moments is actually a humanization effort that would lead to one day the ability to say that these certain things are wrong. So I just want us to pause for a second. And before we get on the bandwagon of just saying the God of the Old Testament's evil and Jesus is good, and so we should ignore the God of the Old Testament, I would say, hold on. Jesus is actually the embodiment of that same God. He is the representation of that same, he's the very essence of that same God. So whatever you're saying about that God, you're actually saying about Jesus. We can't differentiate the two. What we can do is begin to look at the ways in which we read the text and evaluate the ways that we're actually misreading it. That's me just saying. The last thought I would have about this, and I'll close on this whole subject, is I've said a lot here. That doesn't mean that there aren't more questions about it. I want to invite you into a conversation. If you have a deeper, more specific question rather than is God of the Old Testament, what's up with that dude? But you actually have some stories in the Bible that you want to reflect on with me, share those in the comments, and maybe we can begin a dialogue together about how to actually see that text and deal with it maybe the way that is more helpful for us, understanding that this God is the same God of Jesus, and maybe we can find a way forward through those texts. So I want to invite you into sharing me those verses, and let's try to unpack them together and see what happens. That's all. So there's that. I'm just saying. All right. I want to thank you all for your comments as they've been coming in. This is commenting on your comments. And I've taken in videos past some negative comments and kind of just worked through some of those thoughts. Today, I actually want to work through a comment that I really appreciated that came in recently. This one is from Counter... Gosh, some of these names, y'all, I don't even know how to say them. So it's up on your screen, 6068. You can read it for yourself. This was such a rad comment. I just want to read it to you. It says, hey, Joe, I can tell you're a good dude and sincere. Respect. Thank you very much. I'm glad that that's coming through in this video because I do really care. He says this. I deconstructed from Catholicism a few years back for a variety of reasons. Many of them are logical and I fear will require the second coming to show me otherwise. I'm doubting Thomas 2.0. This is a comment that was made on our Losing Your Faith, You're Not Alone video. And I talk about doubting Thomas in that video, so I think that's what he's referring there to. And so here's his question. or statement/question. One example, I do not accept the creation story outlined in Genesis. It goes against science, natural order of things, and does not account for evolution, which I very much believe in. So walk me through this. I love this. This is great. This is such a great comment. If Genesis isn't real, that equals Adam and Eve didn't happen. Without Adam and Eve, original sin isn't a thing. Without original sin, there's no need for forgiveness from a Savior. Picking up what I'm putting down here haunts me. I desperately want there to be a God. I suppose I've always leave room for one. I'm just not convinced that God is what any organized approach claims him to be. It's a shame, really. If God were more obvious, I would live to serve him. Crazy that eternal torment in hell is the punishment I would receive for getting this wrong dispute, truly seeking, and have practiced for 25 plus years. Appreciate your content and approach. No pressure to get back. Well, here's my getting back to you, and I'm responding to your comment. First off, thank you so much for the very generous and thoughtful words that you have shared on this channel. I'm telling you right now, it really encourages me, because these are the things that are the reason why we made Whiskey in the Writings, a place for comments just like this. So I want to say thank you to that. I want to tackle this in a couple ways. So first off, you make the statement, I don't accept the creation story outlined in Genesis. Well, that's a big statement, because I would wonder, what is your version of the creation story in Genesis? Because if it's what the 6-day literal creation story, I would agree with you that's not, I don't agree with that either. There's actually different ways to read this story that actually is more life-giving and more profound than maybe you've ever imagined. And to that end, I'd encourage you to check out the videos Genesis 1 that I did when I launched this channel. The video quality isn't quite the same as this, but you'll get the idea of how I think we ought to read Genesis 1 and the creation story. So what do I think is happening in the creation story? I think the creation story is about two things. It is about helping humans understand their identity and vocation through the lens of a God that's different than any other God that would have existed prior to that time. And so reading Genesis and the creation story faithfully and honestly is about recognizing that this isn't a story telling us about material origins. It's actually a story telling us about why we are here and who we are. And in that, through that lens and in that story, it's a beautiful one about a God who gives to his humans the dignity that separates them from all of his other creation, calling them image bearers, making us the very image of himself. And then he doesn't simply end with that. He gives to these humans. So he sets up our identity. We are the image bearers of God. You are not an accident. You are not a mistake. You are not the sum of your choices. You are an image bearer of God. You have the divine spark inside of you. And if you choose to live out that reality, God wants to partner with us to continue to build a beautiful creation. That's the story of Genesis 1 and 2. And so you have these two characters, Adam and Eve. Let me just say this right now. We don't actually know their names. Adam and Eve are Hebrew names. The Hebrew language wasn't around at the very beginning of creation. It was developed later. So, and it was a morphing and an evolution of an earlier language. So to even say that Adam and Eve were the first names, we don't know. That's just what the author ties to them. And these two humans, whether they were the first humans or not, which I think is debatable, what we do know is that these names represent meaning and purpose. It's not about a proper name like Joe Oliver. It's about defining the representation of who these people are. So in Genesis chapter 1, at the end, when it says God created Adam, which is the Hebrew word that means humanity or mankind, not a singular male human being. And so we got to let go of some of the traditions that we've been holding on to for far too long when we read Genesis chapter 1. And if that scares you, I'm sorry, it doesn't scare me one bit. So then it goes into like, well, then original sin. And so I guess what my argument would be is that maybe your starting point is just misaligned, because in your reasoning, I would understand your logical conclusion, and it seems very logical. I guess my starting point would be very different. I don't think Genesis 1 is trying to tell us about original sin. I don't think it's trying to tell us about simply the fall of two humans. Is that part of the story? Absolutely. But I think there's something much more beautiful happening behind the scenes, and much more tragic in the same vein. And so it's not a science book. It's not about material origins. It's doing something very, very different. And so I would encourage you to check those videos out. I have other videos too about Genesis chapter 2 being a second creation story. You can check those videos. Maybe they'll be helpful. Maybe they won't be. I'm not sure. But then the second thing you said here, I just want to touch on. You say, I want there to be a God. I'll leave room for one. I'm just not convinced that God is what any organized approach claims him to be. It's a shame. If God were more obvious, I would live to serve him. That's an interesting claim, because again, when we turn to the text, we often want a God that acts like the Moses God or the Elijah God, these primary stories that we have in the Old Testament. But did you know that much of the Old Testament, God does not operate that way? In fact, very rarely does God give his people any type of sign that is very demonstrative. Yeah, anyway, sorry, my mind shut down there for a second. What God does, when he does it, can be significant, but oftentimes there are a period of decades between significant events, even centuries. In the Old Testament, it's easy for us to read one story in the Bible and then we turn to the next story. It's like one story is burning bush, the next story is these crazy plagues, the next story is Red Sea parting, and we're going like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. But then there's a prolonged at times, from Moses's time in the desert, 40 years go by. And so we need to let go of the notion that when we read the Bible and we hear about these grand moments in where God shows up, that we can just expect that of God ourselves, because I just think that's not true. And God never promised us that that would be the way that he reveals himself to us. In fact, what I believe is happening in the New Testament is that God begins to indwell humans through his Spirit, as promised in Acts chapter 2. Jesus promised it in the Gospel of John, that if I don't go, I can't send the helper to you. He will lead you into all righteousness, talking about the Spirit. And what I think is happening when you say, I wish God would just reveal himself, I would argue he probably has in many ways already through other human beings. The way that God chooses to manifest himself in our world today, I would argue, is through the love, the generosity, the kingdom building efforts that people do around you. And so if you've ever had someone that has extended you grace and mercy when you didn't deserve it, that was probably God extending you grace and mercy. If you've ever had a human forgive you for something you've done wrong, that was God forgiving you for something you've done wrong. Remember the story that Jesus, parable that Jesus told about the sheep and the goats? In that story, he chastises the goats, because he said, they were like, when did you show up when you were hungry and we fed you? When did you show up and you were naked and we didn't clothe you? And Jesus' response is, the fact that when you do it to the least of these, you've done it to me. And so he commends the sheep for taking care of people, because that was actually doing that to the Lord. And he gets upset at the goats because they didn't. And the reality is that God is actually moving all the time in our world. We just don't have eyes to see it, because the ways that we box God into moving is often through the lens of these crazy stories that we read about in the Old Testament. So I just want to challenge you with this reality that God has probably shown himself to you more times than you want to recognize, and to look at the people around you and the gifts that they are to you. And maybe that's just God making himself clear to you. So I want to thank you for your comment, and thank you for your time for communicating on this channel, and thank you for watching. All right, folks, that does it for another edition of Whiskey in the Writings. I want to thank you for joining me. If you want one of these Whiskey in the Writing glasses, you can go to storiesoftove.com. You can donate. We'll send you a mug in the mail as long as it's $10 or more, because it takes like $9 to ship them. And so if you want a glass, they're quickly selling out. I got a box over here that I'm growing short on. So donate, storiesoftove.com/give. You can get your own Whiskey in the Writings glass. Thank you for joining me today on Whiskey in the Writing. It's been a great conversation, and I look forward to chatting with you next time. If this has been helpful, you've enjoyed it, like, subscribe, share it with people that you care about, and talk to me in the comments. Till then, cheers.